This Week in Virology, the podcast about viruses, the kind that make you sick. This Week in Virology, episode number 323, recorded on February 6th, 2015. Hi, everybody. I'm Vincent Racaniello, and you're listening to TWiV, the podcast all about viruses. Joining me today here in the TWiV studio, Dickson Despommier.
Hello, Vincent.
Very sunny here in the office, isn't it?
It's deceptively sunny because when you step outside, your breath freezes and falls to the ground and shatters into 1,000 pieces. It's really,
very
really
descriptive.
cold.
Minus 4 Celsius. This morning was minus 15. Let's find out what it is like in southeastern Michigan. Kathy Spindler.
Hi, everybody. Same thing. Minus 4 Celsius, 25 Fahrenheit. Bright and sunny.
Right.
Also joining us today from Western Massachusetts, Alan Dove.
Well, it's good to be on the podcast. I won't say it's good to be in Western Massachusetts.
It's cold.
Boy, is it cold.
Colder than what we just said?
It was. I think it dropped to minus 20 C last night.
Really?
Yeah.
Goodness.
And it's currently minus 6. It's 22 Fahrenheit. And we're the weather service in the forecast discussion. They say that we're stuck in a split flow regime.
Split flow regime.
Dear.
Which, from what I can tell, means we get another damn blizzard every damn week. So.
Yeah, there's one on the horizon.
There's one
there?
coming. We're going to get another foot on Sunday night. I know.
Really?
Brother.
Is that the whole
I
Northeast,
bet.
Dickson?
I was told by someone who I'm supposed to be visiting next week up at MIT that it's he might have to cancel my visit because of that.
Oh. How interesting.
That would be bad. We don't want to talk with Rich.
Also joining us from North Central Florida, Rich Condit.
Howdy.
Welcome back.
Everybody.
We don't want to hear.
Much. I've missed you guys.
We missed you too, but
That's a generic. That's a non-gender specific guys.
We got it.
Clear blue skies, 62 Fahrenheit.
You're
That's
right.
17 Celsius.
oh,
You have your snow shovel ready, Rich?
No, but I'll tell you, my daughter lives in Boston, and she's having trouble with all this. Okay?
A lot of snow, yeah.
There's a lot of snow, and
true.
they're moved out of their house into an apartment while their house is being seriously remodeled. And the apartment's on the top floor, and the snow is leaking through the roof.
Gee whiz.
And it's just a mess. It's just a mess.
Sorry to hear it.
Well,
Yeah.
I've been in touch with Paul Dupre, who we had on the show. And he and I are both scheduled to give a talk out at Penn State in March, and he was apparently giving a different talk out there just recently, or he was supposed to. Flew all the way out there. The plane tried to do the approach at the airport in University Park and couldn't.
Oh, dear.
And so they tried to divert to Harrisburg, and they couldn't do that, so they went back to Philadelphia. So he spent the entire day on airliners and ended up back at home,
Oh, my gosh.
not having been able to give his talk.
At least he
That
got
was the
home.
effect the weather had on him.
What a drag.
Dixon, you okay with that mic?
Perfect. In fact, Vincent has regaled me and President. I'm not
Can't
saying
talk,
this
huh?
right. My tongues are tied. He gave me a new microphone. So how does it
Is
sound?
it like
everybody?
a headset or a...
No, it's a
real
new headset and a new real professional level, 100%.
smile, Dixon.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is it sort of the Chrome Elvis type?
Yeah.
It's the same one I have.
It's on a boom. It's on a boom.
Heil
It's on a boom.
PR40 on a boom. So I just
Okay.
want you to know that you just need to stay a few inches from it, Dixon. If you go off mic, it has very sharp cutoff. That's the good thing about this. You don't get a lot of background noise. Okay.
Got it.
So don't stay on mic, as we say.
Gonna do my
Speaking
best.
of Paul Dupre,
Yeah.
we have some feedback about his episode, TWiV 321, from Fernando, who writes, "Hi, TWiV team. I was rather disappointed that TWiV 321 tiptoed around what is really going on in the discourse around gain-of-function experiments. You and your gracious guest failed to state the obvious, that Lipsitch et al. Are using language to achieve a political objective, the stoppage of research they object to. Bellyaching about inflammatory, inaccurate language is beside the point. That language is used purposefully and achieved its goal, at least for the time being. Climate scientists learned painfully that engaging their opponents as if they were using language in a shared way was a big mistake. Scientific-looking language can be used for all kinds of purposes, from selling snake oil to influencing the wielders of state power, which is what we see with the moratorium. Until the flu virology community is as deliberate about language use as their opponents, they will likely see a sustained shrinkage of their research freedom. And arguments about the importance of unexpected results from basic research are exactly the kind of discourse naivete that delights politically motivated opponents. Sure, it is true, but to decision makers and the general public, it sounds like a dice throw that could as well engender a monster. Sorcerer's Apprentice and all those tropes. Instead, flu scientists and their supporters have to be equally political in their choice of language and examples to convince about the huge risk of closing down research that is essential for developing better surveillance, prevention, and treatment. There were hints of that in Alan's comments about passaging and vaccine development, but that has to be articulated much more strongly. I listened to TWiV before all the other podcasts, but this episode was too wishy-washy for my taste. So I guess you listened to it anyway, because you seem to have, right?
Yeah.
All right, so I understand this point. I thought we were, well, at least I was, and Alan to a certain extent was pretty strident about what Lipsitch is trying to do, but I do agree that we need more specific examples, although that wasn't really what we were trying to achieve on that one.
And I think historical examples, too, of this type of fear-mongering are helpful in illuminating what's going on. I mean, a couple more occurred to me after we wrapped up the episode. Before the Large Hadron Collider, you probably remember the news from the Cassini mission to Saturn, which sent back these amazing images and this terabytes of data about a planet that we very poorly understood before. But a decade earlier, when that mission was being launched, there was a prominent physicist who came out in vocal opposition to it because the power module in it, it's a nuclear-powered, was a nuclear-powered spaceship, which is a fairly common way to power these deep space probes that are going far from the sun. Sure. And he made arguments about how if this thing missed in its slingshot maneuver around the Earth and ended up disintegrating in the atmosphere, you'd irradiate the whole Earth and do all sorts of damage, and this was just going to be awful. And of course, it was a ridiculous argument on many different levels, and it didn't carry the day. But that argument was actually made, and for a while was in the news. And the other one that occurred to me, of course, was Jeremy Rifkin.
All right. Well,
what occurred to me in listening to this stuff, because I wasn't present. First of all, I got to hand it to Paul to some extent for trying to be a moderating voice in the whole thing. I mean, I think that's a laudable thing to try and do, given all the hyperbole. The other thing that occurred to me is that it seems to me that there's just even less than a handful of people that are really driving this thing to the extreme.
Yes.
Yeah, that's correct. That's correct.
And that's frustrating. I don't want to trivialize the notion that this is a worthy topic of conversation, but it has gotten out of hand because of just a couple of strident voices, and that's annoying.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I've always felt that it's really a handful of people who are involved here, and we pointed them out, 2 of them last week. And, we try and have a voice here, but, we are very quiet in the whole universe of things. The flu people have to step up. I sent this email to Paul and Arturo Casadeval, Stacy Schultz-Cherry, Daniel Perez, Ron Fouché, Yoshikawa Oka. And Paul said, I didn't know I was gracious.
He was.
Arturo said, absolutely right. There are 2 people you have to deal with. You have to deal with other scientists and the public, and sometimes it's hard to go at both at the same time.
Perhaps you should send it to the presidential science advisor.
Who's that? Joe Handelsman?
There's somebody that's...
He's one of them.
Yeah, and as high up as you can send it, that will look at it because that's who they're listening to, apparently.
Well, I'm afraid she's behind some of the moratorium. That's what I've heard. But anyway, I, for one, will try harder to be more explicit in why this work needs to go on. Even though I don't do it, I do feel strongly about it. And I tell you, I think on a daily basis of this, it really burns me up. Sorry to pitch.
We recently did, for the last few years, we've done a discussion in the infectious disease class for the graduate students that does the Fouché, the original Fouché paper, and highlights the discussion and takes, a poll and all that kind of stuff. And they were, I think, 10-2 in favor of the work going forward. And even the 2 were on the fence.
Yeah, someone sent a letter in one of her classes. She's a professor somewhere, and she did a poll and had some interesting results too. It was on a recent TWiV, and they discussed it and they repolled. I think that Scientists for Science's approach did well in that poll as well. So it's an interesting thing to talk about. All right.
When we were doing that episode, I wrote down some of the inflammatory language on a Post-it, and I was going to reiterate it at one point, and then I just decided that was a drum we could quit banging, and so
yeah, right, you can't.
I didn't. But there were a number of words that were just simply inflammatory that are in those titles or that are used in the text of those letters or papers. So.
Ms. Fernando says belly aching about inflammatory and accurate language is beside the point. He said that's not what we need. We need examples of why this work needs to be done.
Well, I think recognizing that there is this language that's meant to have that effect, I think is important too.
Yeah.
All right, our next follow-up is from Ramon, who writes, at the very beginning of TWiV 322, Mr. Despommier says, I first pranded, then I posted. Sound recording of the last word was unclear. It's a new meaning of the ancient Latin phrase, primum vivere deinde philosophare. Could be a title for a future episode, primum vivere deinde podcastare.
I said that?
You said I first pranded, then I posted.
I did say that.
What is post from?
No idea.
Because you finished lunch just before.
Postprandial.
Postprandial.
Oh, okay.
Prandial, and then I prandied.
So yeah, because you had just finished your. So I said, "How was
that's
your
right. That's right.
Postprandial?" Yeah,
that's right.
Yeah, and prandial just means a meal in Latin. So post is after a meal.
Indeed.
What's primum vivere deinde philosophare?
I had it for a while.
Live first, philosophize later.
Okay.
I'm for that.
All right.
And so what he's posting is, what he's suggesting is live first and podcast later.
Yes.
We could do both.
Our friend Johnny in Cambridge, the pediatrician who loves our show, sent us measles humor a la New Yorker, sent from a colleague and friend today, best to all. There's a cartoon. There's a child sitting in the pediatrician's office covered with measles. And the pediatrician is saying to the two parents who are looking on anxiously, if you connect the measles, it spells out, my parents are idiots. And at the risk of losing listeners, I'm sorry, parents out there, if you don't immunize your children, you're idiots.
Yes.
This has the anti-vax crowd is taking a bashing publicly from all of this, and it's great to see.
It's about time.
Yeah.
Well, now here we have an outbreak, which we knew was going to happen. We have a measles outbreak spreading across the country.
Sure.
And it's because of not vaccinating, and it's stupid. It shouldn't happen. Now, here, I wanted to just remember, this has become political now. Chris Christie on Monday said parents should have a choice.
Who sent you that?
You, Dickson Despommier.
I sure did.
And he got such hell that he immediately started backing down. All right, so I have a link to a Times.
That's my pick of the week, by the way.
This is your pick of the week?
That is my
I'm
pick
sorry,
of the week.
I didn't know that.
That's my pick of the week.
Well, you can still pick it.
You bet.
And then there was a senator from somewhere who also agreed with him. And I mean, what is this? Have a choice. First thing I thought of is when you're drafted to the armed forces, you don't have a choice. Your parents don't have a choice, and you have a greater chance of being killed or injured, right? What is this?
Yeah.
There was another senator this week who said that requiring
hand washing
employees to wash their hands was over-regulation.
It's so ridiculous.
And just to remind everybody of it's now called antivaccinebodycount.com. all one word.
Really?
145,382 preventable illnesses from June 2007 to January 24th, 2015. So 145,000.
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, there'll be other things too, and I can tell you that one of them will be whooping cough.
Yes.
And that's not a nice thing at all.
No,
That
that's not
actually
interesting at all.
is already starting to break through.
Yeah.
You back, Kathy?
Not yet.
Kathy left. Alan, can you read Sharon's email?
Okay, Sharon writes, I listened to last week's TWiV and noted the comment about editors not doing due diligence with preferred reviewers. I think most, I would hope, editors first check PubMed before inviting a preferred reviewer. The bigger challenge, however, is that some sneaky authors provide names of real reviewers, but make up bogus Gmail addresses for those people, which route the review invite back to them. The issue of bogus email addresses for real reviewers is not as easy to check because many bona fide researchers have multiple email addresses, and in countries where their institutional email systems are not reliable, many scholars rely on their Gmail, Yahoo, etc. So the problem of authors recommending bogus reviewers is not as easily resolved by simply checking PubMed. When I'm using a preferred reviewer for which a non-institutional email .edu is used, I first check if the reviewer is already in our system and use the email we have for them, and sometimes do a Google search on the email address itself or check the reviewer's website for the reviewer to verify the email address provided. That's a good thought.
Yeah.
Man, what a drag that we should even have to do that. You know?
I
Tell me
know.
about it.
Yeah.
That there are people out there who are going to cheat like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sharon happens to be an editor at a journal, so she knows what she's talking about.
At a good journal.
Are you there, Kathy?
I am back.
Can you read?
Oh, good.
Can you read John's email?
Sure. John writes, Dear Twivers, as I write from Manhattan's Upper East Side, it's unacceptable degrees Celsius, and the barometer reads, stay inside and make hot cocoa. My pet groundhog agrees. On TWiV 322, a listener named Natalie wrote in, citing my January article, A Career in Science Will Cost You Your Firstborn Child. Natalie rightly identified the cynicism of the piece as a stylistic choice made to support the position that science is in trouble, but lamented that despite my tone, the facts I shared still make the situation very bleak for new science trainees. The facts she's talking about are my least favorite thing about the piece. I found it very depressing to see how many people read my work and shared it with commentary like, well, now what I do with my life, or, oh God, what have I done, in the characteristic raw, punctuation-free emotionality of internet commenting. I didn't write that to hurl people into despair about their future. Natalie asked if there was a path or advice that you could share for someone looking to get a PhD or otherwise become a scientist. I liked how you answered her questions, but I also wanted to chime in with some of the things my more cynical tone didn't emphasize. Firstly, I wanted to say that I don't think getting a PhD is a bad financial decision. Getting a PhD with the objective of becoming a tenured basic scientist is unrealistic, yes, but getting a PhD with another goal in mind? Your likelihood of employment, as well as your earning potential, are improved with a PhD. Furthermore, the opportunity cost is reasonable, $60,000 to $100,000 in lost wages in order to graduate with no debt, not even for basic cost of living, better than an MBA. The problem is the value you lose if you try for that tenured basic science career path after you get the doctorate. So I would recommend that interested people still go for a PhD. So would I recommend that interested people still go for a PhD? Well, like you said, if you can imagine doing anything else, do that. But I don't think that people who enter a PhD program with reasonable expectations are hurting themselves as long as they take caution and realize that their end game after graduating has to be something like going into industry, government, policy, consulting, or some other field. There are a lot of ways to use a PhD, and as our biological capabilities expand, our society finds itself in need of experienced, trained scientists to do jobs relating to the interaction of science with business or the public. PhD graduates still have a lower unemployment rate than the general population. The problem is that most PhD students don't want to be a regulatory official or a writer. They want to be a scientist creating experiments. While that's possible in some places in industry without a postdoc, I don't think I'll get much argument if I say that it's not possible outside of nonprofits or academia if you wish to become a basic scientist. I'm carrying uvula viruses to Newcastle here. I'm not sure what uvula viruses are, but
I'll
okay.
look it up.
All right. But let me just say that basic science is where we really change the future. Despite this, the humanistic value of basic science is as hidden in its data as the artistic value of Van Gogh's work was during his lifetime. It is often many years before the impact of a basic science discovery can be digested and its real value revealed. In general, if we knew what we were doing to get if we knew what we were going to get when we began doing the research, it wouldn't be science, it would be engineering. Basic science takes that idea to its purest form, and in line with that, it gives us the biggest surprises. And yet there isn't a clear path to a career in basic science because the only place it can even barely get funding is in academia, and that's drying up too. That's the main problem I was getting at with my piece, that we are making basic science impossible to do by making the impoverished PhD to postdoc to tenure track path the only place for a basic scientist, and that's going to hurt science and society. There are other problems, yes, but I think not enough attention has been given to the human toll, both financial and psychological, of the basic science career path. Sometimes I'd rather cut my ear off than do a postdoc, sad as that makes me. I outed myself under my real name at a recent scientific conference, saying that I'd written the article in question. To my surprise, a lot of PIs congratulated me and were incredibly supportive. This is a community that is ready for attitudes to change, but most people are at a loss for solutions. To paraphrase one senior PI at the meeting, the piece is depressing because the data on careers in science are depressing, but awareness of the data has never hurt science, it only helps. Once awareness is high, we can start working on solutions. I'm doing that a little behind the scenes, but I'm nobody, and I'm just one nobody. I want to see what other people come up with. To summarize, I'd tell Natalie that there's a good case for getting a science PhD. It confers skills and abilities, particularly if you are humble, smart, and dedicated, that you'll only get from a PhD's feet-to-the-fire training style. Furthermore, you will get the opportunity to make a real contribution to human knowledge. Even if your findings are later overturned, your contribution was real and it added to the conversation. It cannot be taken away from you. Knowing you can walk into a dark tunnel and find the light will benefit you in any line of work that involves problem solving or risk. But unless you're uncharacteristically brave, lucky levels of P less than 0.01, or independently wealthy, I would not recommend going from a PhD graduation into a postdoctoral fellowship or planning on getting to a tenure track position. If your destiny is to be in a professorship, you'll find your way to it eventually, and if not, at least outside of academia, you will be able to pay the bills and more. I've gone on quite a while, so I'll close by wishing all of you, hosts and listeners, the best of weather, data, and discovery. John, and he's a student at Icahn School of Medicine.
Well, this, of course, we talked about a lot in the past, the idea that PhD, postdoc, PI isn't the ideal sequence. However, I see a lot of really good postdocs. I see people still getting jobs. So I understand why you're negative about a postdoc, but I don't think that you should tell everyone not to do postdocs. Because right now that's the system we have, and until we change it, I agree we need to change it. If no one does postdocs, then where are we going to be, John?
Well, you'll be without the indentured servants who run the research enterprise currently.
Well, then there's no research getting done. I agree that we need to change.
The problem is what's happening to the people who are postdocs. And yes, your point is valid that people are getting jobs, but people also win the lottery. That doesn't make it wise to buy a ticket.
Oh, but that's totally different. Come on.
Really?
Alan, we are hiring people here. Frequently at Michigan, they hire people. They do job searches. You have wonderful people coming through.
Oh, sure, they hire people. But
it's not a lottery. I'm sorry.
How many applicants do you get for each position?
We don't get huge numbers, and we get incredibly talented people who have done great work, who are articulate, and they get job offers.
And there are huge numbers of great, talented, articulate people who don't.
I'm not sure there are a huge number of great, articulate people who have done incredible research. I really don't think so, and it's never been that way. I think in the old days there are people who did okay research, and the system was such that they could get jobs, but that's not the case anymore. Now, I'm not saying that we can't change it, Alan.
I think just based on the numbers, that we can't honestly say that the only people that all of the talented people are actually getting jobs.
I didn't say that. I didn't say that. I said talented people who are articulate, etc., are getting jobs. I didn't say all of them were. Would you like us to stop doing postdocs tomorrow?
that would be abrupt, but there's got to be some kind of a shock to the system, because the people who have the power to change it have an entrenched interest in not doing so. We've talked about that.
Mm-hmm. Well, as Bob Dylan once said, the times they are changing, and certainly when I look back at my own career, I would never have learned the level of science that I became familiar with and comfortable with unless I had done a postdoctoral experience. And I was lucky enough to get one at Rockefeller University, which is filled with overachievers, basically. They've got oodles of Nobel Prize winners, and they've got lots of equipment and nothing else to do all day long except to think, which is fantastic. I mean, that's the best environment I could have possibly ended up with. But if I had to go right out of my PhD into a job, which I was offered a job at the University of Maryland as a teacher of the subject which they just invented called human ecology. I have no idea of what that job would have led to. That was a job that I could have taken and stayed in that and probably would have achieved tenure at the university. But I would never have traded those 3 years that I had at Rockefeller for anything in my life. I just had the most amazing time in my whole
I just would not.
experience.
I would not put a negative spin on all postdocs. Okay, I understand the problems, but it's not fair for him to say, "Don't do a postdoc," and I'm not doing one, or I want to cut off my ear and say
Today,
like that.
I could not in good conscience advise somebody to do a postdoc if they're looking at a basic science career, because I don't think it's a reasonable. I don't think that it's a viable career option for 99% of the people who go into it, and the statistics back that up.
Well, the other thing that I want to say, I've been trying to get a word in edgewise here,
sorry.
is that
it's Kathy.
there are other jobs for which currently having postdoctoral work is important, and that includes some industrial positions in science, teaching at primarily small college teaching institutions, and students from my lab have done postdocs for as short as a year and a half to up to I think probably 3 years, and gone on to those kinds of positions. So I don't think that we have to even limit postdocs to people who are going to go to careers in basic science. There are still other careers where it's important to have that additional experience.
I'm not
at the
convinced
moment.
Yeah, I mean, yes, those job listings will say postdoctoral experience desirable, and yes, you can get those jobs after a postdoc. That does not mean that the postdoctoral experience is an essential gateway to those jobs.
Well, as Dickson said, I couldn't have my job without a postdoc. I got great training.
But you're
right?
you're talking about a job market that existed, with all due
that's
respect.
true.
I mean,
No,
quite
you're
some
right.
time
You're
ago.
absolutely right.
Oh, I understand
And
that.
those days are gone.
They're
So,
not gone yet. They're still here, and we have to figure out what other approach we can use to get the work done and to train people. I think the idea of staff scientists is great, but you're going to go from a PhD to a staff scientist position, so that means someone's going to have to train you for a few years to do things. I mean,
Why not?
It could work, but I'm not seeing it. I'm not seeing that being adopted immediately.
What I see is that we need to get past the implementation barrier, which is immense. And if a generation of graduate students deciding not to go to postdoctoral systems temporarily shuts the system down, and that's the shock we need, then I'm okay with that.
No. Don't shut the system down, because then NIH says, "Oh, you only need half the $30 billion. Fine, we'll cut it to $15 billion, and then we're screwed." No. We don't want to shut it down. We have to have a transition.
Right, we should. But if you see, if people in the PI position see that the postdoc tap is suddenly running dry, that labor source is not available to you in the quantities it was before, then I think that may be the kind of trigger that's necessary to get things fixed for real, because otherwise I just don't see it happen.
All right. Unfortunately, as you know, on a daily basis, I have 10 emails from China and India and Africa and Malaysia asking for a postdoc, and those are not going to dry up, and people will take advantage of those. If all the European or U.S. or whatever postdocs dry up, that's what. So it's really hard to implement.
But then at least the U.S. and European postdocs who would have ended up in their second or third or fourth postdoctoral positions still not having a permanent position, at least we saved them from that fate.
Yeah. Well, I think we ought to get John on here, and we'll talk about it some more.
Yes.
But I just don't like I understand the negativity against postdocs. I'd like to gradually cut it out and do something else. but a lot of people are still doing postdocs, and they're having careers, and I don't think it's fair to them to shut them off.
Right. Well, at Rockefeller, they didn't call them postdocs. They called them guest investigators. Maybe if we change the name, that'll help.
And that's an even earlier era. Yeah.
That's right.
All right.
So, by the way, a virus is a paramyxovirus, and the type species is Newcastle disease virus.
How funny.
So what's the
So
saying
you're
from
carrying Newcastle disease virus to Newcastle.
Yes.
Oh,
what's
very good.
What's
Thank
the
you,
original
Rich.
saying?
Coles.
Saying Coles to
Coles
Newcastle.
to Newcastle.
Coles to Newcastle.
Because Newcastle's a
Very
cold
good.
town.
Very
So
good.
that was quite good, John.
Fabulous.
Okay. Now
Now for
That was
something
good. That was
completely
heavy.
different.
Yes.
hey, Alan, I got a postdoc for you.
Yes.
I'm going to post it.
We have a paper here, which I think is interesting.
We do.
Published in Cell, and it's called Disease-Specific Alterations in the Enteric Virome in Inflammatory Bowel Disease. And the authors are Norman, Handley, Baldridge, Droit, Liu, Keller, Campbell, Monaco, Zhao, Fleschner, Stappenbeck, McGovern, Keshavarzian, Mutlu, Salk, Gever, Xavier, Wang, Parks, and Virgin. And I picked it because I really always look for things that, well, first of all, human virome is really interesting to me. I think it's understudied. The microbiome of the bacteria in us gets a lot of attention, but I think the viruses are certainly beneficial, and that's why we did those norovirus papers in part, and so this caught my eye. This is about inflammatory bowel disease, which is a chronic inflammation of your digestive tract.
You don't want it.
You do not. From what I've heard from people who have it, yes, very bad pain, diarrhea, fatigue, weight loss.
Yeah.
So my son has some form of inflammatory bowel disease, but exactly which kind we don't know, and it really makes his life, and he's 17, it's pretty miserable. So these include ulcerative colitis is one form of it, and Crohn's disease, and I'm sure you've heard of these. These involve inflammation, sores, ulceration. And so people have been very interested in understanding, of course, the cause of it, and the focus has been on the microbiome. And there's been a number of publications which indicate that there are reductions in the certain kinds of bacteria in the gut, and expansion of rarer ones that may not be as beneficial.
And specifically, a decrease in both richness and diversity of bacteria in disease. And we need to talk about those terms.
Kathy, what's richness and diversity?
So richness is the number of taxa counted per sample, and diversity measures both richness and the relative abundance of the taxa that are present. Or
Right.
you can think of it as how evenly distributed among all those taxa.
Right. So interestingly, if there's your gut microbiome, your microbiome period is really majorly influenced by where you live, your household environment. So with time, everybody in a household pretty much gravitates to the same or a very similar microbiome. And if someone in a household has inflammatory bowel disease, their co-inhabitants can develop the same microbiome, and that can affect the permeability of their intestine. They don't actually have the disease, but they develop phenotypes that are consistent with it. Now, viruses, the question in this paper is, do viruses play some role in this syndrome? Because they haven't been really addressed. And of course, bacteriophages infect the bacteria in our gut. We have lots of them in there, and we don't actually know how they, for example, in a household situation, how they are passed around. So that's what this paper looks at. They look at people with inflammatory bowel disease, and they look at the virome in their gut. And there's been some previous evidence that the virome makes a difference, mainly in mouse models. Now, I had a lot of trouble with this paper. I typically don't have trouble with papers, but I got really frustrated because I think there are a lot of, first of all, I don't think it's particularly well written to explain the data. And there's a lot of stuff in here that I think should be in the methods section, but maybe I'm just an old fart.
And a lot of stuff that should be in the methods section that's not in the paper.
Yeah, so I have a lot of problems. And I'm going to really give an overview, and if people want to jump in and present something specific.
I'm with you. I had trouble too. I think that there's a couple of key findings that we can summarize, and to get into detail would be a quagmire.
Yeah, and I think the data.
I agree.
I'm not really persuaded about a lot of what they're arguing.
Yeah, I do too. In fact, that's what we should talk about, the conclusions, because I'm not convinced that there's something big here yet. So, all right. So the gut virome is mainly bacteriophages. There are eukaryotic viruses in there, and you'll see they look at that a little bit. But there are mainly two kinds of double-stranded DNA-containing phages, which Rich will really like. One kind of double-stranded DNA-containing phages. These are the caudovirales, which is an order and contains lots of families of the tailed phages.
And it basically covers the vast majority, if not all, of the double-stranded DNA-containing phages, importantly, including both lytic and lysogenic phages.
Right.
So this includes phages that can establish a latent phase and be induced, a prophage state, and ones that are strictly lytic and can't do that.
Right. So they say here the bacteria in the human intestine are predominantly temperate, which means they're integrated, right? Latently infected, double-stranded, or a single-stranded microviridae, which is a family of single-stranded DNA phages, which tend to be spherical, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, there are two different single-stranded DNA phages. There's filamentous ones and there's spherical ones. These are the spherical ones. Like the sort of type species is Phi-X174.
Right. Mm-hmm. So they say that, on different kinds of insults to your intestine or taking antibiotics or drugs, you could induce replication of these phages, and they could lyse their hosts, and that could cause or contribute to diseases. So that's one of the reasons why they're looking at this. So they basically got stool filtrates from 3 independent cohorts of people with inflammatory bowel disease, and then their household controls who don't have IBD. So that's a nice matched set, right?
Right.
Pardon me.
And they kind of have to take the household controls because of the fact that the microbiome has a tendency to be shared amongst close contacts.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Right. So, in fact, I think later on they do another series of samples, and they don't have the household contacts, and they use controls from different households, and that's not optimal because you get differences. Yeah, and these are from the United Kingdom, the United States, 2 cities, Chicago and Los Angeles, and they had in this first sample 12 household controls, 18 Crohn's disease, and 42 ulcerative colitis. And they basically find that caudovirales and microviridae are the most abundant, and they find other viruses in there. They have actually a little graph which shows all the different kinds of viruses that they identified. They, of course, did deep sequencing. I think they purified particles, right?
The way I understood this in the first figure, that is not purified particles.
Is it just
it's
sequencing?
DNA infiltrates, but they were vague here, so it was hard to understand. But in the subsequent things, they talk about like figure 3. Let me see if I got it. Figure 2 and onwards. I think they're talking about. They say specifically that they're talking about virus-like particles.
Okay.
And I looked up the references that they cite in the methods because they don't say exactly how they do it. One is a methods paper and another is a research paper. And the research paper is taking filtrates that come through a 0.2 micron filter and then isolating virus-like particles by density gradient centrifugation on cesium chloride. And the methods paper talks about doing either that or a couple of different ultrafiltration techniques, or a polyethylene glycol precipitation, which we used to do. It precipitates phage. But the optimum way to do it, if you could, I think, would be banding on cesium chloride, because that's really going to pull out the phages. So I just decided I would assume they did something like that, though they are not specific.
So this in the figure they have a nice graph of all the different families and orders and versus the relative abundance, and you can see The lowest is the picornaviralis. All the way on the left, very little. And all the way on the right, mostly microviridae and caudovirales.
And I believe that's from the metagenomic analysis, but it's reflected in the virus-like particles as well. Except that if you do the virus-like particles, you're not going to get a lot of these other eukaryotic viruses because there's some membraned guys, and they've even got a pox virus in here. I wonder what that was.
Yeah. But Vincent, don't feel bad about your picornaviruses. Adenos aren't even listed.
Oh yeah, they are. But I'm surprised because they are there, right, in the gut.
And they found them in the simian immunodeficiency virus.
Yeah, that's right.
Paper. But I guess it must have been in one of the supplemental things. I found something called virgaviridae, and so that was another one I had to look up. And those are positive single-stranded RNA viruses that infect plants. But it caught my eye because Skip Virgin was an author, and I thought, did he name a family
after himself?
They've got ficodinoviruses here, and then iridovirus. So they've got some viruses that probably were associated with a person's diet. Baculoviruses, right? If you eat lettuce, you're going to have baculoviruses.
Irritable bowel disease, by any chance?
Good.
All right, so caudovirales and microviridae are the most. Everything else is really like 5% or fewer.
Right.
You add it up, so there's not a lot of other things. And then they say that these two have an inverse relationship.
Yeah, that's...
I guess
weird.
One is high and the other is low, or vice versa, right?
Right. When one is high, the other is low.
Right.
I think that's the way I take it to mean.
I would agree.
And then they say comparing household controls within the to IBD samples within the UK cohort revealed that this disproportionate representation was associated with IBD. Okay, that's puzzling to me because if you say in the controls it's inverse, then how can it be associated with IBD? But if you do look at the pictures, in the controls, I'm looking at relative abundance of household controls. Microviridae and caudovirales look pretty similar. But when you look at the ulcerative colitis, there are way more caudovirales than microviridae. And if you look at the Crohn's, it's the caudo is a little higher.
Okay. The way I take this is that if you have a lot of one, you'll have less of the other.
And then you have Crohn's.
But if you group everybody together, on average, in household controls, the two are pretty much balanced on average. But if you look at the disease state, the caudovirales there's an imbalance slanted towards caudovirales. That's the way I look at it.
I agree.
This is where I started to have some problems. I mean, not just with the way it's written, but with the data. So the UK sample, the one that shows a clear difference to me is the microviridae caudovirales for ulcerative colitis in the UK sample.
Right.
I get that. The Crohn's disease sample is just the error bars are bigger than the graph.
Yeah.
And then you've got the American samples, the Los Angeles and Chicago.
Huge error bars.
Huge error bars, and I'm wondering, if they're going to argue, first of all, I know from the title that they're going to try and argue something about Crohn's, which in this analysis at least is all over the map. And then secondly, the US samples and the UK samples don't jive.
That's right.
Which is just really suspicious and suggests to me that there's something else going on that's not disease driven, that's what they're actually looking at.
Okay. Yeah, I agree with you. I was looking at these and I'm thinking, what am I missing here?
Right.
So it's just not clear. Yeah.
And the thing that occurred to me was diet, but there's no discussion of diet in the paper.
Yeah, I thought of that when I finished because the diet could simply be, and people who have IBD eat differently.
Are going to be on a different diet, which would make them differ from the household controls, and that's also not discussed.
Right. Yeah, that's a big issue. I agree with that completely. Yeah. All right, so then they purify particles, as Rich said, to try and look at this in more detail. Same individuals, I think the same samples. And here's where this really bothers me. Now, you guys tell me if I'm wrong on this or not. I understand that sequencing are the data here, but here, for the UK cohort, we obtained 1,111,569 plus or minus 493,000 paired end sequences per sample with an average sequence quality of 36.5 plus or minus 3.7. Quality control trimming resulted in an average of 2% reduction I mean, this goes on for a paragraph. Now, is it that I don't appreciate this, or shouldn't this be in the materials and methods? And then they should have the results in graphs? What do you guys think about this? Or maybe we shouldn't even...
Well, I certainly sort of glaze over as I'm reading that, and so it certainly wouldn't make any difference to me if it went in materials and methods.
I mean, I understand it's the quality of the data, but you're still going to make a graph of it, right? So.
Yeah.
Right. And each time that came up, I'd be reading along and just having to kind of filter that stuff out and come slam into some more sequence read data. And
Yep.
Yeah, I read it as, for the UK cohort, we obtained blah, 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 blah. And then there were no statistically significant differences in the number of total, and then I picked up again.
So here now they're getting sequences of genomes of purified particles, so then they have to assign what taxonomy they're at. So they have to do a lot of bioinformatics. And they did one thing which I just want to mention because we didn't talk about it on TWiV at all, but there's a phage called the CRASS phage, CRASS-PHAG phage, which, so Rich, you remember when we talked to Eric Dalwart, he's always saying all the dark matter in sequence, right?
Yes.
So what they did here is they developed a bioinformatic protocol, this was another paper, where they could scan separately generated sequence databases and find out what was in common. And they found this phage, which had never been seen before. Like 80% of the open reading frames are unknown, but they could tell it was a contiguous, like a 97 kb circular DNA phage, and it's in most people. It's in most of the samples that have ever been looked at.
Right. I found this fascinating. They managed. I looked this paper up as well, and they managed to basically discover this phage by searching dark matter.
Yeah. And
okay.
the point being that this has been there. It's in most people, but we never saw it because we never recognized any of the protein.
So that's virtual subtractive hybridization.
Yeah, more or less.
Yeah.
Now, they looked at it here, and it didn't matter. It didn't correlate with the inflammatory bowel disease, but in some ways I found that a more interesting story. And I'm reading this, and I'm going, I should have done this paper. All right. So basically, they find the same thing, right? They find increased richness of caudovirales in IBD. They don't find any richness in microviridae in either richness or diversity.
So in either of these diseases, Crohn's or ulcerative colitis, there are an increased diversity of species, types of these things relative to the household controls.
Yeah. And we have to point out that when we say caudovirales, there are tons of species lumped in there, right? So I don't want you to think that it's one.
Right. No, there's a whole bunch, and there's an incredible diversity within that taxon.
So, Rich, how specific are any of these phages for a particular species of bacteria?
Well, that's something that I was missing as well. I think that there can be quite a bit of specificity, and I wish they had discussed that more, because as we'll get to, there's a decrease in diversity of bacteria and an increase in the diversity of the phage, and so you wonder whether, I mean, one of the things that I wondered is whether that's because you're getting induction of prophage in a certain portion of these bacteria, so the bacteria disappear because they get lysed, and you get an increase in diversity of the mature phages out the other end. They didn't state that, but that strikes me as a perfectly reasonable explanation for what's going on. But I can't know that to be the case unless I know what the relationship is specifically between the different phage types in the bacteria, and I don't.
Right.
There can be very stringent specificities, I believe, between the phage and the host, but I'm talking on the I'm skating on thin ice there.
I like your use of, what did you say, out the other end?
Yes. Yes.
Was that on purpose, Rich?
No.
All right. They also find differences in richness and the types of phages between the Crohn's disease and the ulcerative colitis samples. Okay, so far we've just said that the caudovirales in general are up, but now they find differences in exactly what kinds are there between the two different diseases. Each disease harbored unique phages, okay, and they apply some statistics to that. and they say that using this statistics, they identified 35 different caudovirales that were significantly associated with different households. They have a very nice figure, which, if you look, it visually makes this very clear, I think. They have a nice one where they show in a kind of, I don't know, what's this red and blue type of graph? They're just listing all the phages that are present or absent.
It's like a heat map.
Yeah. And you can see the difference between household controls, Crohn's, and ulcerative. They're all different. Right?
And that's nice. That's a very nicely visual representation, and the Venn diagram showing the overlap of the different types is good as well.
Just for somebody who might happen to copy this black and white, like I did, that figure A is like 3 gray boxes.
It doesn't go well in color.
Yeah, the blue and the red just come out the same.
There's also a nice graph of caudovirales richness, and you can see the Crohn's. It goes way up at a steeper rate than ulcerative colitis, and then the household contacts are way down.
So here's another problem I have with this, and this took me a long time to sort out. If you look at parts E and F of that figure 3, it shows the specific distribution
in each household, right?
In each household. And it took me a long time to figure out that these are the longitudinal studies.
Yes.
So, for example, if you look at Q, they have 4 samples of controls and 6 samples of disease. And my understanding because they don't tell you this, but my understanding after fussing over this for a long time is that is 4 different, those are 2 people. And there's 6 samples from one person and 6 samples from a diseased person and 4 samples from a control. If you look at P, there's 1 sample from a control and 11 samples longitudinally from a diseased person.
Okay.
Okay, so my question, and they aren't clear on this either, is do each of those, and there's actually quite a lot of variation
huge
over time in those individuals. I mean, look at P, okay? He's all over the map.
Yep.
Okay, on different sampling occasions, he changes dramatically in terms of what's going on, and that doesn't correlate with disease. Right?
On one day, he's only got 2 phages, apparently.
Yeah, and they're completely different than another time. And I looked back at the longitudinal study and tried to figure out whether there was any correlation with disease episode and what their virome looked like, and I can't see any. And they say that there's no correlation between disease and the bacteriome, okay, but they don't really comment on the virome. Now, my question is, do each of these samples comprise part of this database? So when you're talking about diversity, are each of these individual samples a sample in the database? Because if so, you're taking multiple samples from a single individual. And how does that affect the data? Rather than a bunch of the equivalent number of samples from a whole bunch of different cases.
Yeah.
You're not talking about 40 cases here. You're talking about 40 samples from some lesser number of cases. I mean, I'm not using the exact numbers, but I don't know how that impacts on the data.
And there's huge variability in the controls as well as the cases. I mean, if you look at a Q again, you actually have 4 samples from one control, and it's fairly consistent for 3 of them, and then it just goes wacko. And the only other one where multiple samples, I guess, is F, and they're just like, I don't know where these, totally different.
Yeah, those 2 samples from the control are completely different.
Yeah, the 2 samples from the control are totally different. The disease state, the second 2 samples from the disease state are very consistent.
But very different from the
first sample. So this was another one where first of all, I didn't get as far as Rich in figuring out what the heck was going on with this graph. But even now, understanding what all this is indicating, it doesn't really show much to me.
However, if you do the average thing and you look at the heat map and you look at the Venn diagram, it does appear that in either of the disease states, on average, the diversity goes up, Not only that, but the variation in diversity seems to be different in the two different disease states. So if there's any take-home message, that to me, that's it.
That's it.
Yeah.
I wonder if any of the authors on this paper could summarize this for us in a highly comprehensible way.
Well, there's the figure on the first page.
Oh yeah, what is
graphical
that?
abstract.
The graphical abstract.
The graphical abstract. The cartoon of this thing it makes a lot of sense.
But that can't be all there is to it, right?
Right.
Well, I think it is.
When you look at the data, unfortunately, I'm just not finding the support for all the bits of that cartoon.
So the next thing is part of this this graphical abstract, which is and you can see this in the figure in both Crohn's and ulcerative colitis. There is a decrease. So then they went and sequenced bacterial 16S ribosomal RNA so they could figure out what bacteria are present in these samples. There's a decrease in both diversity and richness in the Crohn's and the ulcerative colitis compared to the household controls. And the graph of that, which is, I think, figure, I don't even know. I've lost the numbering here. Is it 4?
It's 4A,
yeah,
I think.
4A. It looks okay. The error bars are big, but the centers of the error bars are different, and they have good p-values. That looks correct. And if you look at these longitudinal samples that you were talking about, they are much more consistent with respect to the microbiome.
Yes.
Right. And
Yes.
so that there are differences, but obviously the core composition is similar.
I hope their figure legend is wrong because they say that 2 stars means P is greater than 0.01.
I hope not, right?
Yeah. Hope it should be less than 0.01.
Yeah. Now here's where I had an issue. So we have a reduction in diversity and richness, okay? But they say, and I can't get this, a significant inverse correlation was observed in Crohn's disease samples between codovirales diversity and both bacterial richness and diversity, which suggests that bacteriophage expansion was not simply the result of increases in their bacterial hosts.
Yeah, so you might think that an increase in a host would give you an increase in a certain type of phage, okay?
Right.
But they're not even seeing increases in numbers of bacteria. They're seeing decreases instead. But I think you can, as I just said, I think a similar, you could still say that the reason that the bacteria are decreasing is because the phage are killing them.
Yeah, that's right.
And that's why you get more phage.
Okay, got it.
I never saw any discussion of that.
Yeah.
Okay. And I think they've got enough information here on phage and bacterial types so that they might be able to make a statement. Are the phage that increase, do they correlate with the bacteria that decrease? Okay.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Right.
Yeah, I think it's...
But to me, there's a certain amount of sense in this. There could be. It could be that the correlation or lack of or the inverse correlation actually makes sense. It could be that the bacteria are going away because the phage are killing them, or that the phage, conversely, that the phage are increasing because they're killing the bacteria. And if most of these are, I'm really spinning off into la la land here, but if most of the bacteria carry prophage, and the conditions of the gut in these diseases are such that you would induce the prophage, that's exactly what would happen.
Yeah. All right, so they also looked at a couple of other cohorts, and they don't have controls that are as good. They make the same conclusion, so I don't think we need to go into that. They look for eukaryotic viruses in these samples, and they didn't really find anything that correlated with disease activity. So they it's 2 sentences for that. So they don't think there's much going on there. Although I would argue that probably you need to do a lot more sequencing because you're missing a lot of viruses.
Yeah.
All right. So basically you have an expansion of codovirales in these 2 diseases. It's different in the 2 diseases. The kind of expansion is different, and a decrease in bacterial diversity. And so what is the relationship to the disease? And I think at this point it's just an association because, as we said earlier, it could simply be diet. It could simply be an effect of having a different bacterial population, right? And not a cause.
Yeah.
Right. I think the whole causality thing is, like you said, it's an association.
So how would you address this? Just keep doing more of these sorts of things? I mean, I'm not sure where numbers is going to help because every household is going to be different, right?
Well, and even in different geographic areas, as we see, you've got 3 different geographical areas, and only one of them even really shows this phenomenon convincingly.
Yeah.
I wonder if you could do some kind of animal studies where you could administer phage or, try and get at it that way.
Yeah, and induce inflammation like
Right.
this.
Good
Yeah,
point.
could be. They actually say that another consequence of this change in the phages could result from interactions between the viruses and the host. So they say they could get into the bloodstream and trigger inflammation, innate responses and inflammation. And that could be part of the pathogenesis. The gut becomes more permeable in these inflammatory diseases that could let phages in, which then are detected by the innate system. You have more inflammation and you get this feedback business.
There are quick PubMed search. There are apparently several mouse models for Crohn's and IBD that are varying degrees of artificiality. Of course, the mouse gut is completely different from the human gut, but that might be a place to start where you can actually control diet. They're all going to be in the same place. You could start them all with the same microbiome, more or less, and go from there.
Sounds like a natural for a germ-free animal study also.
Yes, of course.
So to me, basically, the bottom line is this is something that had to be done. Okay.
Yep.
You had to have a look.
Yeah.
They see some differences. It's not clear to me at this point how reproducible the differences are going to be across different populations and over time. And it's also not clear whether there's, what the relevance is of those differences to the disease. But you had to do it, and I'm glad we have the information.
Mm.
Yeah.
Also, one of the implications that they talk about, among many, is that this might have some implications for fecal transplants.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point.
Right.
Yeah, because you're transplanting the virome as well as the bacterial.
They note that the fecal transplants haven't been very good for IBD, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it could be because of the phages are just limiting it, yeah.
There's another little statistic that we missed here that we neglected to point out here, and that is in the experiments where they're looking at virus-like particles, and they tried to type the sequences. They could only type 15% of the sequences. So even in virus-like, I presume the remaining 85 are effectively dark matter.
Mm-hmm.
But they're dark matter that are in, presumably reasonably pure virus-like particles. So there's still a whole lot of stuff in there. The majority of stuff is stuff we don't know about.
Yep.
Yeah.
Just a couple other points. One, they make the statement, current databases lack sufficient depth for us to be able to link specific phages to individual bacteria or disease.
Okay.
They don't have enough sequences out there.
Okay, there you go.
And one more thing, they close with, they say other diseases like diabetes, obesity, metabolic diseases, cancer are all associated with changes in the microbiome, and they're saying we should look at the virome in these.
Sure.
And they say this study tells us that we should look at the virome, and I would agree with that, absolutely.
That's the next grant proposal.
You bet.
Yep.
These are expensive projects.
Yeah.
All right. Did we do well there?
I think we did okay.
Yep.
This is why we have journal clubs, right? You get a bunch of people together talking about a paper,
Yeah.
and you can all figure it out as a group.
Yeah.
All right. Hey, Dickson, you there?
I have to leave.
I'm sorry, yes.
Yeah, you have a good reason.
Yes, I'm on a mission.
Good
Right.
luck. Thank
Say
you.
hello to
Thanks.
Alan for us.
Thanks. We can just save my pick for next time.
Okay.
Okay. Thanks, see you guys.
Bye.
Yep.
Take
Bye,
care.
Kathy.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Hey, Dickson, can you read?
I can try.
You want to read the first email?
I'd be delighted to. So, Annie writes, Dear TWiV, when I entered a medical lab technician program 2 years ago, I introduced myself as someone who has always been in love with pond scum. Parens, if only there was an electron microscope in my basement. Ah, boy. You'd find me there too, I think. Since the 4th grade, I have been in love with the unseen world of microbial life. I am a shameless TWiV groupie. I have lamented for years the obscurity of most clinical textbooks with their incomplete indexes and material that usually gets too technical before building a base of understanding. I have had a few recent bouts with hateful texts, which seems to conceal knowledge rather than yield it freely to eager minds. When I read, I just want to start with quick access to unfamiliar words in order to have a working understanding to decipher more complex ideas. One thing I found was a cycle where I would attempt to look up a word and it was not defined, but merely referred back to the text. This is just one example of many, and I believe I know why books are written this way. They are not written for the student, but to other collegians. I suspect they want to gain and keep tenure or other accolades in the field more than they want to relay information. And Vince, you're in the midst of writing a book right now, so beware. I grew up in an area where there are 2 major universities, one of which is considered among the top 10 in the country. I have known and been surrounded by many truly brilliant people. Most of my high school friends' parents were among the tenured faculty at that university. I noticed that people who are true intellectuals love to share their knowledge. I found among this group true teachers who did not look down on those less educated, but rather their own love for the material was so infectious that they could not help but to reproduce it in others. As science-based careers become more available to more diverse groups of people from various backgrounds, I feel that someone must stop and examine this issue. Books could be written to be more quickly understandable, especially as many programs have become shorter. And this process could be made more palatable. After all, education is a business, and currently they are not serving their clientele as well as they could. Sincerely, a new lab tech.
I think effective communication, to some extent, if not a large extent, is a gift. It's hard to teach. It's hard to learn.
Yeah.
And not many people are in possession of this, even among college professors, and in particular in research-intensive institutions, you aren't necessarily hired for your teaching skills. So you find quite a lot of people, even in educational institutions, that just don't communicate well, either verbally or in textbooks. So the real readable material, the real good lectures are hard to find.
Yeah, the best way to learn how to teach well is to be taught well.
Yeah, I think I had some good teachers that I tried to pay attention to. Were you guys the kind of people who sat there in class, and when somebody is giving a lecture and it sucks, you're telling yourself how you would do it differently?
Oh, absolutely.
Yes.
Yeah.
Sure. Mm-hmm. In fact, I got a chance to do just that. I mean, during my graduate education, I volunteered to teach, and they just sort of looked at me and said, "Have you had any experience at this?" And I said, "Well, a little bit. I used to teach to the technicians when I was a master's student at Columbia." They said, "Oh, okay." So somebody said, "I have to take a trip next week. Would you mind giving my lecture?" And I jumped at the opportunity, and I never stopped. Even though I screwed it up to begin with, I recovered, and I got lots of useful information back from the students who said I gave too much information, and that sort of thing. So you can start to really hone your skills at a very early time in your career if you have the desire to do so. I encourage everybody to teach. I really do.
The Dunning-Kruger effect comes into play here, because if you're really crummy at teaching, you probably don't know you're crummy at teaching.
Yes.
Okay.
Right. And if you can't simplify what you're doing and explain it to a layperson like your wife or husband, and make them still interested in what you're doing afterwards, then you probably don't understand what you're doing yet.
I actually discovered that as a study technique in college. I discovered how useful it was to just explain the concepts as if I were teaching them.
Great.
And I'd study a section in a text, and then I would try and teach myself, how would I deliver this organic chemistry lecture?
Very nice.
And it really forces you to think a lot harder about the material.
Yeah,
I'll say.
I think that's one of the reasons it's so effective to study in groups, because in a group you wind up trying to explain it to each other.
Right. So when I was taking my literature courses in undergraduate school, I learned what a Homeric simile was. And I never forgot, because if you can take something out of nature that relates to what you're doing and make people see it as that, because they're familiar with that, of course, then they'll understand what you're doing too. And so I've tried to maintain that kind of an approach to, using common examples in everyday life to explain complex things that I might have to convey to audiences that don't necessarily have the in-depth scientific knowledge that I would like them to have.
At any rate, who is it? Annie is challenging us to write the books.
Yes.
Vincent, you're already at work on this.
Well, Annie, I'd be happy to send you a chapter of our book to and let you see if you think it's confusing or if it's okay, because I'm sensitive to that. So send me an email. Okay, and I can.
We had an offer from one guy, at least at Columbia University Press, that wanted us to write a book called Virology for Dummies.
That was for you and me, Dickson?
Yeah, it was.
Yeah. Well, that's, someday.
I'll co-author that with you.
Excellent.
That's on my pick list as well.
Excellent.
But we got to write the cell biology and genetics for dummies first, because that's a prerequisite.
Yeah.
That's true.
Rich, can you take the next one?
Sure. Tim writes, Dear TWiV friends, listening to the podcast yesterday night while attempting and somewhat succeeding to break loose 8 inches of frozen cow manure from a pad of concrete that had accumulated thanks to the sub-zero weather over the past couple of weeks, I found myself agreeing out loud to your discussion on whether science is hard or not. Being a lot like Rich in my thoughts that science is easy, but with the qualifier that I've been at it for a while, may not be giving those without spatial or system thinking sort of mind due sympathy, because without those abilities, visualization of concepts either too small or massive to, quote, see, unquote, would be awfully hard. It's funny reflecting on my love of science when I think back on to how little joy I found in it during high school. The forced memorization followed by regurgitation onto a test with precious little context for the information of pre-college science courses takes most of the fun and excitement out of learning, or at least it did for me. I wonder if a better system of learning science wouldn't be through more contextual discussions like a case study approach Dickson is so good at, where terminology and application are learned through frequency of encounters as well as context. That's the approach I've taken with teaching my own children science, where we discuss a scientific topic that comes up at dinner at length, working in new terms among known ones and asking them lots of questions that require critically thinking about the subject. Just my thoughts I felt I'd share with you, mostly out of a passion for spreading the joy of science, curiosity, and critical thinking. Have a great week, and I look forward to you joining me next week through my headphones as I bounce along in my skid loader doing chores.
So you shovel large loads of cow manure while listening to TWiV. We will just let that Homeric simile sit there with people.
Yeah, I had to look up and see what a skid loader was.
Somehow
it's a front end loader.
Somehow, Alan, we have to get a title that uses that plus today's paper.
It's exactly right.
Yeah,
a skid load of viromes.
So the case study approach, Dickson, you want to briefly tell them what you just did with TWiP?
Yeah, actually, we added a new member to our crew, Dan Griffin, who happens to be a first-class physician and is newly appointed here to our ID staff. And it occurred to me a long time ago it would be a great idea, but now we did it, of having a case of the week, basically. An unknown, he presents the clinical presentation of someone who comes into his clinic, and he does some tests, and we're allowed to sort of rummage our way through the physical and clinical diagnosis, but we never come up with the answer for that episode. We always wait until the next one. And then, of course, there's a crucial test that he didn't tell us about, like do a blood smear and stain it with right stain and then look at it under the microscope, and then you can see what the answer is. And clearly it's a fun way to do it. And we've had lots of good email from that as well. So I think it is fun to use single cases and then expand it out into general principles.
Yeah, I think Tim is right. That sort of teaching by real examples rather than just facts and stuff makes all kinds of sense. The medical curriculum here at UF and in many other schools is going more and more that way, where you don't get biochemistry and physiology and pathology and microbiology anymore. You get you get cancer and respiratory systems and cardiovascular, and you learn the biochemistry and the pathology and the microbiology that are associated with each of those systems and disease states.
Right.
And
so it's a much more contextual way to do it.
New England Journal of Medicine has a column in each issue or a paper in each issue, something like cases from the Massachusetts General Hospital. They do a case, and the object of the game, of course, is to figure out before you get to the end what the answer is.
And the New York Times magazine section often has a medical section like that too.
So the thing I like best about this letter, aside from the skid loader and the cow manure, is when he talks about teaching my own children science, where we discuss a scientific topic that comes up at dinner at length.
Right.
Yeah, it's
so
good.
They're sitting around a table, having a discussion, and they're probably got, I always used to have a 1-volume encyclopedia by the dinner table, okay? And stuff would come up so I could look it up. And then we had a real encyclopedia in the back room, so if the 1-volume didn't do it, we would, make the trip. Now you just have an iPad. Okay.
In the Dove household, accessing an iPad or iPhone type device is only acceptable at the table if you're looking up something that's directly related to the current conversation result. and we have these types of scientific conversations at the table where we go in considerable depth with our 9-year-old daughter and talking about how stuff works.
Alan, could you take the next one?
Lance writes, Dear Family TWiVidae, many thanks for your excellent coverage of the South American dengue vaccine trial. You did a particularly good job of discussing the aspects of the paper which are outside the usual TWiV topics, like intention to treat analysis versus per protocol analysis, things which are very important for those of us who have to make treatment decisions based on the results of clinical trials. I wanted to add a note of caution to the interpretation of the results of this and the 2 large Asian dengue vaccine trials. I'm probably being overcautious here, but for me, the question of whether or not these vaccines could predispose to more severe dengue disease is not yet adequately answered. This is because the highest risk of severe dengue disease occurs on the second infection. Therefore, the group about whom we are most concerned becoming predisposed to severe disease are those who were dengue naive at the point of vaccination. Based on the numbers given in the 3 trials, details below, 5,430 people who are dengue neutralizing antibody negative have received at least 1 dose of vaccine, extrapolating from the percentage of the vaccine group that was antibody negative at baseline in the immune endpoint subsets from each trial. If you take only those that were conclusively shown to be neutralizing antibody negative, the number falls to 741. Both these sample sizes are likely to be too small to reliably detect an increase in severe dengue. The situation is further complicated by the fact that absence of neutralizing antibodies, at least in some prospective studies, does not seem to equate to being completely immunologically naive. For example, in a study by Anderson et al., attached PDF in northern Thailand, 76% of subjects who were neutralizing antibody negative at the baseline of a 3-year follow-up period, in fact, showed memory responses when they had their first flavivirus infection during the study period. That was a very high anti-flavivirus IgG early in infection. Furthermore, in the first Thai Phase 2b dengue vaccine trial, there was no efficacy against dengue 2 despite the presence of neutralizing antibodies in conventional assays. This perhaps means that the neutralization assays are measuring something which correlates with protection after natural infection, but not after vaccination. Lastly, there's considerable variation in the ratio of symptomatic to asymptomatic infection between years of infection, serotype, and geographical location, leading to significant uncertainty in the numbers of severe dengue cases expected in any given time period. For example, see the attached Endy et al. PDF. The data are derived from the same Thai cohort as Anderson et al. The CYD tetravalent dengue vaccine contains the PRM and E envelope genes that together make up the outer part, including the surface of the viral particle. There's evidence that the phenomenon of antibody-dependent enhancement thought to be responsible for severe dengue is due to antibodies against PRM exposed on the surface of immature dengue viral particles, and cites another paper. What might be a viable alternative vaccination strategy is a subunit vaccine based on E protein homodimers that can induce broadly neutralizing antibodies. This work from Gavin Screeton's group was just published in Nature Immunology. Vincent mentioned it in your episode. I look forward to hearing more discussion on this on TWiV. You can see more about exactly how these antibodies bind the E protein in bewildering detail here, and he links to a paper, which is in Nature. So if there does turn out to be a problem with this vaccine and severe dengue, we have another approach up our sleeve. That said, we should still recognize the enormous effort it has taken to get this vaccine as far as it has gotten and undertake these hugely complex trials. A quick comment on why there are 4 dengue serotypes. This is thought to represent 4 separate introductions of different viruses to humans from the sylvatic cycle, and cites a reference. This isn't really my field, but I understand from colleagues that dengue 3 is diversifying a lot, more so than the other dengue viruses, and it's possible that this may give rise to serologically distinct viruses. Can't give you a reference on that one, I'm afraid. The weather in Liverpool is 4 degrees C and sunny right now. Sounds balmy to me. But alternating rapidly between sun and rain and maybe even some snow, who knows. And then gives a substantial amount of data from the vaccine trials and some calculations on that.
So the concern is that the individuals who were naive at the beginning and got only 1 dose of vaccine, they're at risk for severe dengue because they may have suboptimal responses to one of the serotypes.
Right, that's the way I take that.
Okay.
But it's going to be hard to squeeze that data out of those data out of the trial because those numbers are pretty small.
Yeah.
I see. So not until you license the vaccine and go into millions of people that might show up, right?
Well, and that's the case with a lot of these things. There's some rare issues that don't show up until you actually release it and go into the population. Now, the anti-vax people will have a field day with that kind of stuff, but I'm sorry, that's reality. Yeah. It's the way it goes. And when and if that stuff crops up, you do something about it. After all, the original rotavirus vaccine was withdrawn.
Yeah.
And it's not even clear that was that was justified. But
and we're not talking about the common cold here. This is dengue.
Right.
This is a very, very serious disease.
Stuff.
So and they're doing very careful and very large clinical trials to try to find that sort of thing. But yes, there's always a concern.
Well, with this paper on broadly neutralizing antibodies we mentioned, we'll do it at some point in the future. But
is that the same one we were talking about?
I believe so, yeah.
Okay.
All right, the next one's from Len, who writes, "Hi, Vincent, everyone at TWiV. I had a rather disturbing experience last night on Twitter." Well, that's par for the course on Twitter. Sorry. That I wanted to share with you. I received a tweet from someone who was retweeting another user's message, basically saying that vaccinations had harmed her son. She did not specify what had happened, but was obviously trying to convince people not to get vaccinations. Being a big advocate, I replied, "Vaccines save far more lives than they harm. Without them, millions of people would die every year." And the person who retweeted it replied, "A speculative belief based on falsities and absurdities, be gone." And then the person blocked me on Twitter. And at that point, Len, you should have just gone to bed.
Yeah.
Because you're never going to win with this. So there are 2 things that bother me about this. First, blocking him rather than engaging. And then he gives us ways that he was going to cite how vaccines have helped, like smallpox, polio, yellow fever. And then he says, "To me, simply blocking my messages without engaging is a reasoned and factual conversation about why we both believe the way we do is indicative of someone who is operating at a purely ideological level and will not even consider the facts informing and maintaining an opinion." And then he complains about the person's statement of a speculative belief and says why that's not correct, as we all understand it not to be correct. Where I'm going with all this is as background to set up 4 questions I would like to ask all of you. 1, are the 3 examples I gave above accurate and reasonable to use in conversations with vaccine deniers? Yes.
Yeah.
They're all fine.
Yes.
2, what are some other examples and arguments that can be used in this type of situation? Measles is another one that has gone down to nearly nothing, but has reemerged when we stop immunizing. I think that's a good one. It shows what happens when you stop immunizing.
Yeah, and not a viral infection, but certainly whooping cough.
Yeah, there are lots of bacterial examples, right?
Yeah.
how does one counter this type of broad dismissal? I think you cannot. You have to just ignore it. Because on Twitter, anyone is an expert, and they will counter anything that you say. What do you think, guys?
Well, I have a counter, but I can't say it on.
You know, the pediatricians, I keep coming back to this one show that I heard about this, and the pediatricians had the best answer to this conundrum, and by saying to the mother, do you value me as your pediatrician for your child's health? And she said, yes. He said, well, if you refuse the vaccination, then I will no longer be your pediatrician. And to which she said, oh, in that case, go ahead and vaccinate. It was that casual. And not that firmly held. So there is a veneer of resistance that can be expressed like this, and then they can be flippant all they want. But when it comes down to the nitty-gritty of whether their kid's going to be sick for something else, if the pediatrician is a believer in vaccination, I think that's what's going to happen.
There are two groups here. There are the vocal, hardcore believers who you will never reach and never convince no matter what. And it's best not to try. You know, if you're arguing with an idiot, people may not be able to tell which is which. So if somebody has completely closed themselves off into that belief system, just forget about it. And it sounds like this individual, you know, who just replies that way and blocks you, obviously you're not going to get to them.
Right.
But then there's the majority. You know, parents who want to do the right thing by their children, and they Google vaccines, and they come up with all sorts of stuff, and they don't know what to think about it. And, you know, a lot of them end up leaning toward what their friends are doing, and depending on their socioeconomic demographic, if there's a Whole Foods store in their community, they're likely to refuse vaccinations. And I'm sad to say there is a certain... And I'm part of that demographic, but the way to counter that within the broader community, and Kathy actually pasted this useful link here. It's something that we've talked about before, I think, this report showing that confronting somebody who's anti-vaccination with facts is only going to harden their position.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Because it's not a rationally arrived at position.
Yeah.
It's far more effective to approach it in a way like what Dickson just said, which I think, you know, the pediatrician's saying, this is important. It is so important that I will not continue caring for a child who is not going to be vaccinated.
That's right.
I think a lot of people just don't get how big a deal this is.
Yes.
And when you put it in those terms, they say, oh, wow, I didn't, you know, and here's somebody I know and trust personally.
That's right.
This is not some celebrity former Playboy bunny who's writing on the internet. This is my pediatrician.
Got it.
That carries a whole lot more weight than saying, you know, measles used to cause a lot of suffering, and now, well, except for what's going on, it can come back. Those are more abstract.
Yeah, I think we have done such a great job with our vaccination programs in the past that people have now no memory whatsoever as to what it's like to have these diseases circulating through their kids. And so therefore they don't take them serious anymore until they see a case that develops into an encephalitis and the kid dies at the age of 9 months.
Exactly.
You know, and then that becomes the poster child. That mother will be a vigilante for this. I guarantee you they'll go on every talk show. They'll be on Oprah. They'll be everywhere showing pictures of their child, how sweet they were. And I made the fatal mistake of not vaccinating my kids. So,
and in fact, one of the most powerful messages that I've ever seen on that was from a group called Families Fighting Flu. Which I think I gave them as a pick of the week at some point. And,
yes.
You know, I earnestly hope that I never qualify for membership, but what they do is great. And it's not an appeal to facts. It's just, you know,
got it.
Here's what happened.
The lung cancer group has been doing a very good job with this lately on television with ads for a cessation of smoking by showing a lung cancer victim that talks directly to the audience. And so, you know, it's every now and then you have to rediscover the wheel.
Yeah, it has to be on a personal level. And one other thing that that carries an enormous amount of weight, I've seen this in my own experience talking to other parents, but it's also apparently the research backs this up, is saying that your own child is vaccinated.
That's right. That's right.
And that has to be true, of course, but
well, you're right.
I've you go to the birthday party and you're talking with other parents, and I've mentioned that I had to go get my daughter's flu shot. Oh, do you get flu shots? Oh, yeah. And then you get into the vaccine conversation, and it carries a lot of weight that this is something that not only does my daughter get it, I get it, my wife gets it. We do this.
Yeah.
It's interesting when Christy had to back off this week about his statement of parents having a choice. He said, all my 3 kids are immunized. That should tell you where I stand on this.
Oh my God.
Which is good.
I'm sure his PR people said, "Man, you gotta cut this off, otherwise
you just lost the Christian right. Evangelicals, they're gone."
Anyway, Len ends up. Do you have any idea specifically what this person meant when they said a speculative belief based on falsities and absurdities? To me, either the vaccines work or they don't. Either they have detrimental effects or they don't. There's relatively little room for ambiguity. So in my experience, that's just a typical thing that an anti-vax person will say, which has zero truth in it. But if you engage them, it gets worse.
Right.
Yeah.
Right? There's no logic to it.
Nope.
Len.
The person saying it doesn't even know what they mean.
So the other day I tweeted this Christie thing and I said, idiot. And, there was a lot of response, which I ignored. And one person said, isn't it true that when people are immunized, there's an outbreak of the disease you're trying to prevent? And I said, geez, yeah, you want me to engage that? So, anyway, to close, the temperature here in Smyrna, Georgia is 18.8 Celsius and mostly cloudy.
Smyrna.
Thanks again for all you guys do. The podcast is wonderful, and I hope that you all have many more episodes ahead of you. Thank you, Len. And let us do some picks of the week.
Wait a minute.
Yes, sir.
I get to do a 2-minute sit rep on Ebola.
Oh, I forgot. Yes. Sorry. I haven't even...
Because, we can't be like the newspapers where this is now on page 4 and nobody pays any attention.
Go for it.
Real quickly, I put in a link to this one that I think this is new. They've got like a 1-page summary that's nice because they got all the graphs and a 3 bullet point summary on 1 page. There's good news and bad news. More good news than bad news. The good news is that if you look at the graphs, the number of cases per week has fallen dramatically in all of the affected areas. Yeah. All right, down to less than 100 per week in each of the areas and down near 0 in some of them. So this is being brought under control, and that's great. The bad news is that over the last week or 2, there's been a slight uptick in all 3 areas, Guinea, Liberia, and Sierra Leone. And so the message is we can't, because things are looking better, let up on the vigilance. And they're particularly concerned because the wet season is approaching.
Yes.
And it gets more difficult to get care to remote areas. So it's all looking good, but it ain't over, and we can't stop yet.
Yeah.
An unfortunate effect, which we can deal with, is that it's not possible to test vaccines and antivirals when the cases are gone, which is rapidly approaching.
Yep.
But that's a good thing.
Fine.
That's a good trade-off, I think. Yeah.
That's true.
All right. Alan, what do you have for us?
I have a tool that I just discovered a couple of weeks ago. If you're ever browsing around doing any kind of research on the internet and you find a site that you want to reference or you want to refer back to it later, and then you save the link in your bookmarks, and then a few months later you say, oh yeah, there was that site. You pull it up in your bookmarks and it's gone, or it's totally reorganized, or the page that took you hours to find is been moved. This fixes that. And it's useful for other things too. I actually got it for a totally different purpose, for archiving a site. If you have say a WordPress blog that you know is never going to be updated. No, not Turpid Plaque. This was actually for the one where I did my grandparents' letters, and they're not writing any more of them, so I know that the blog is done. But it had this WordPress installation that, of course, I had to keep putting the security patches on, which was very annoying for a blog I was never going to update again. So I used this thing. It's called SiteSucker, and you can get it for your iPhone or for OS X on the Mac. You point it to a particular site, and you tell it just save a copy of that site, and it does.
So will it download like all the images,
all
everything?
the pages, all the whatever you can point it to a subpage of the site, which would be a good idea if you're looking at a large site and a subpage of it. Or in my case, I pointed it to the Walter and Ina blog, and I said go to it. And that being a large site, and I told it the top level domain to do. It took it about 20 minutes. But it just sat there grinding away. It saved all of the possible pages. It followed all the links that were local to that domain. It downloaded all the pictures. It saved everything as a static HTML file and tied it up in a nice, neat folder.
That's cool.
And then you can open that on your desktop computer and browse around it, even if you're offline.
So it doesn't follow any links outside of the domain you give it.
It doesn't go right. Otherwise, you would index the entire internet this way.
So that is, it's taking a point in time at that site, right?
Exactly. So the other thing is, if you're worried that a site is going to change, perhaps it says something that you think somebody's going to try to disown later. And as a journalist, this comes up from time to time. You can snapshot the site, and you can do screenshots, of course, in any browser, but this actually saves
the whole
a
site.
copy of the entire site as a static file with the HTML itself and any associated
Sounds
images.
like a mini hard drive.
Some of the files must be huge.
If depending on the site, I mean, if you were to point this to youtube.com, it would probably just eat your hard drive and go for years. But use it wisely. Obviously, point it at stuff that you actually want to save.
Wow, cool,
nice. Rich, what do you have?
This Dave Bloom sent me just for kicks. It's titled. It's from IFL Science, and it's titled "Hungry Snake Picked Wrong Dinner," and it is a picture of some viper from Macedonia that has tried to eat some really big, ugly centipede, and both of them suffered from it. It's a picture of the snake ruptured with the centipede's head sticking out of it.
Lord.
The centipede was nearly as big as the snake. Not that snakes don't do that kind of thing, but apparently these centipedes are really tough to kill under the best of circumstances.
Yeah.
And the most fun part of it's incredible how big that centipede is relative to the snake. He's more than half the snake, and they're both the snake is like 20 centimeters long. At any rate, when they looked at the snake, most of his insides were gone. So the centipede had been trying to eat his way out, apparently.
Lord,
And
but
finally
didn't quite
made
make
it.
Wow.
Well, he finally made it out, but then he expired.
Yeah.
good heavens.
So there you go. That's your gross pick of the week.
Gee, thanks a lot, Rich.
Sure.
Sweet
Anytime.
dreams.
Nature is tough.
So
Nature
when you're
is
sitting around the dinner table talking about this science pick, I wonder what the kids will think.
This is actually
More snake?
It's a jungle out there, right?
Certainly is.
Sure is. Dixon, what do you have?
Well, I sent you that one. I sent you the Christie pick. But I also sent you something else. The Sapporo Ice Festival is now underway, and the winners will soon be announced. So I think the Sapporo Ice Festival is worth keeping an eye on, because in the next week or so before our next TWiV, I think the results from this will come out. So I think go look at it. It's quite amazing. And Rich, I got it almost for you specifically because one of the ice sculptures was a portrayal of the characters from Star Wars.
Excellent. Yes, I see it right here.
And it's dramatic. I mean, they go to great lengths to make sure that they got all the details.
They're
It's
amazing.
It's fabulous. It's absolutely fabulous.
Cool.
I don't see your other pick. I'm looking at my email, Dixon.
It's the
long
cartoon.
time ago. No, I sent it to you a long time ago.
A long time ago?
Yeah, it was
Was it the cartoon, Dickson?
No, I just sent him a reference to the Yahoo News item from Christie that said every parent should be allowed to choose whether they get their kids vaccinated.
I'll find that and put it in.
Yeah.
Yeah, very good. All right, my pick is an interesting piece that came out all over the place, but I'll have the Wall Street Journal link. Big Data and Bacteria Mapping the New York Subway's DNA.
Oh, you're right.
So a few scientists here in the city
The underground dome?
Mapped. They went through all the subway stops and they swabbed turnstiles, chairs, pass machines, and all sorts of places. And then they went back to the lab and did PCR to see what it was. So they actually have an interactive map that you can use. You just click on a subway stop, and it tells you can look by station or by bacteria type at what you got. So, for example, we could look here at 168th Street, Dickson.
Yeah.
Would you like to know what we got here?
Well, I think you're going to get a lot of things there because that's an exit point for a hospital.
Here you go. 168th Washington Heights, the A, the C, and the number 1.
Yeah.
They identified 108 unique bacteria.
Of course.
And they had swabbed the bench, the MetroCard vending machine, stairway rail, and turnstile. So they, and then you can click and see, for example, food poisoning is Bacillus cereus, urinary tract infections, toxic cleanup, oil cleanup, Pseudomonas putida.
There's got to be a cyclical
hey, an
thing
Italian
to this.
cheese.
Italian cheese. Yes, isn't that funny?
That's wonderful.
Each clinic probably has its own meeting time point. So I bet you if you did a weekly swabbing, every day you get a different
Enterococcus italicus, often found in cow's milk, a species of bacteria used in a variety of artisanal Italian cheeses. So I don't know how it got there.
That's cool.
Someone left their lunch there or something.
They found no tuberculosis.
Hey, this is very cool. I didn't. Well, actually, let's see. Explore by bacteria type.
I would expect
respiratory ailments, right?
Sure.
They don't have any TB. No. It's interesting. Anyway, the other part that's cool is that they find non-bacterial DNA. So here at Washington Heights, 39% was human, 4% insect. Probably cockroach, right?
Right.
0.6% green plants.
Any rodents?
0.01% rodents.
Well, that's a typical tier level for the trophic levels for an ecosystem.
It's very cool, and it's studies done by Weill Cornell, American Society for Microbiology, CDC, NIH, a bunch of other places, and there's a paper associated with it. I think it's pretty cool.
Yeah.
Neat stuff. They should look for the viruses, though.
And the parasitic eggs and cysts.
Yes. We have 2 listener picks. One is from Gretchen, who writes, I found this video about how to cut a cake based on mathematician's method.
That was great.
That was published in Nature. It seemed like something that TWiV hosts and listeners would enjoy.
That's perfect.
Yes, very nerdy.
Thanks for all the effort and time that you put into the podcast. And Leslie writes, Dear TWiV show hosts, I have been listening to TWiV and the other Twix shows for almost 2 years now. I've come to enjoy your shows very much. My compliments on the above-average audio quality that you have for your podcast.
Oh. Vince's face just turned red.
No, I thank you. I appreciate it.
Absolutely.
Now Dickson should be even better. The listener pick I would like to contribute is Principles of Virology, Molecular Biology, Pathogenesis, and Control, 1999, second edition by Flint, Enquist, Racaniello, and Scalca. I will admit I'm not a scientist by training, but I do enjoy learning new topics. I am recommending the second edition because it is affordable and a great way for the seriously curious layperson to better understand what you are talking about in the podcast. I probably won't study it cover to cover, but I can look up most of the viruses and jargon you discuss on the show. The edition is $13, including shipping on Amazon.com, and in my opinion, money well spent. Keep up the great work, and I hope that research moratorium gets lifted very soon. Mm-hmm. Nice. Regards, Leslie in Ashland, Oregon.
Cool.
I didn't fabricate this or forge it.
No, this is, you had nothing up your sleeve. You've never met.
If you had forged it, you would have advertised the current edition.
Exactly.
That's right.
Because this one you don't get a cut from. This
Nothing. This is a used one. That's a good price.
That's actually a really good general idea if you're not taking a course but you want the text, buy an older edition.
Yeah, that's right.
In fact,
much cheaper.
A few students have come up to me and said, could I buy the second edition? I said, yeah, sure. No problem. All right, that'll do it for TWiV 323. You can find it at twiv.tv, also at iTunes. And, more and more people are using podcast apps on their iPhone or Android device. And these are free apps typically that you can use to subscribe to a podcast, and it will automatically download new episodes. I use Downcast. There's another one called Overcast. You get the use of cast, right, Dickson?
Absolutely, like the last cast.
The last cast. And anyway, you can also get it on those. Just search for TWiV or TWIP or TWIM, you'll find it. And do send us your questions and comments to TWiV@TWiV.tv. Kathy Spindler is at the University of Michigan. She has left us because Alan Alda is speaking at the university right now, and she hoped to tell him about TWiV. So good luck to her. Dickson Despommier is at verticalfarm.com. Thank you, Dickson.
You're welcome.
Do you like your new mic?
It's perfect.
Good.
It's perfect.
Rich Condit is at the University of Florida in Gainesville. Thanks, Rich.
Sure enough, great time.
Good to have you back.
Yeah.
Great to be here.
Yep.
Yeah,
Today was the entire tweet.
Felt like a full team.
Right?
That's
Yeah.
right.
And Alan Dove is at turbidplaque.com and also on Twitter. Thank you, Alan.
Always a pleasure.
And you can use, what is that name of the app again? Sightsucker on
Yes.
Turbid Plaque.
Yes, which I'm going to be updating Turbid Plaque a bit more. I just did a major reformatting of the site and going to be doing some more blogging again.
Turbidplaque.com. Let's see what Alan did here. Ooh, it is different.
Yeah.
I disagree with Vincent Racaniello.
No,
that's
been
from
up there since
October.
October.
That's
Yeah.
October. That's okay. We did today as well.
Yes, we did today again.
I must say, Alan, your site from here, and I'm not up close to it, but from here it looks like a Hubble deep space shot of galaxies in a far, far away place.
Well, it's a plaque assay.
It's a plaque assay.
Actually, it's a kind of my own rendition of a plaque assay. It's not an actual one.
Why don't you make some more of those movies? I like those.
I may do that.
Oh.
I'm Vincent Racaniello. You can find me at virology.ws. You've been listening to This Week in Virology. Thanks for joining us. We'll be back next week. Another TWiV is viral.